So Margaret Sanger went after the legislators and she went after the taxpayer dollars. But there is another element that she used in order to construct this coalition that has managed to entrench abortion in our country, and it's the medical establishment. She specifically and deliberately made a strategy of going after and co-opting the medical establishment. Why is it that abortion needs a warning label but it does not have one? Why is it that the American women do not understand the health risks of abortion? It's because Margaret Sanger went after and co-opted the medical establishment. But today Byron Calhoun is at the forefront of breaking that silence in the medical arena. He is a professor and vice chair in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at West Virginia University. He has been published very extensively. He's authored over 70 peer-reviewed articles. He's presented over 100 scientific papers and participated in over 40 research projects. Very noticeably, he was invited to testify before the Congressional Subcommittee on the Constitution just this past year in May 2012 on the Pain Capable Unborn Child Act. And so I'm very glad to have him here today, and he's going to talk about the health risks of abortion to women.
And I also like to tell you, I'm not representing West Virginia University. I want to be very clear on that. This is representing the science. I'm representing myself professionally. So you understand that this is coming from where the science is to this date. And what I want to do is talk about three things, all right? And I want to set it out so we know where we're going, because those of you who are very German, like my wife, want to know where we're going, right? They want to know the roadmap. And for those of you like Irish, like me, it's just the story. So there's three things we're going to talk about today. One is increased risk of death by abortion. We're going to talk about increased risk of mental health problems. We're going to talk about increased risk of preterm or very preterm births. And I really like this statement because an Irishman made it. But Edmund Burke said, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. The time has come now to join Burke by addressing this evil perpetuated against women by elective abortion. Elective abortion advocates would have the world of women believe that there are no harms in abortion. They would have the world of women believe that they could take the life of a human being, of the member of the Homo sapiens, and they would suffer no ill effects. We knew this was not true in 1973, but the lack of scientific evidence to support that assertion did not exist. Now, however, this data does exist. Even so, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Psychological Society, Planned Parenthood, and NARAL still refuse to acknowledge any risks with elective abortion. But the risks are real, and they include the risk of death, increased risk of mental health problems, increase of risk or very preterm babies, and delivery. It was recently quoted in 2012 as a myth of the mythology of the American College that in 2012 they published an article in Obstetrics and Gynecology that always says the same thing, which just makes my blood boil, actually. The risk of death associated with childbirth is approximately 14 times higher than abortion. The statement is unsupported by the literature, and there is no credible basic scientific evidence to support it. It is simply false. It's simply false. A reasonable woman and a man would want to find any discussion about the risk of dying from a procedure that would be material. That would be important and significant, would it not? Informed consent would say you should know what you're getting into before you do it for a surgical procedure. In order for us to be able to address this, we must have objective and reliable information concerning this particular abortion or particular procedure. Now, unfortunately, methodologically, this is complicated, and there's lots of factors that talk about making valid assessments quite difficult at times. Among them are incomplete reporting, definitions that are actually incompatible. What does this mean and what does that mean? Political correctness, which is probably the major issue, I would say. Inaccurate, incomplete death certificates, the incompatibility of various maternal mortality statistics, and the failure to include any sort of death certificates that include homicides or suicides as a result of abortion within the mortality statistics. Given the importance of the disclosure, the lack of this credible and scientific evidence requires substantial discussion. And this is where it's going to get a little more complicated. Bear with me, we will get there. First, abortion statistics are totally unreliable in the United States. The only people that report is the CDC. It is voluntary. Only 26 states report. California does not report. The largest abortion provider outside of New York does not report to the CDC. It is purely voluntary. So, there is no data. The CDC data are unreliable because they're based on estimates with voluntary submission by state departments of health, including West Virginia. It's voluntary to report your complications and your abortions in the state of West Virginia, whose accuracy is widely known to be inconsistent and unreliable. The only other institution, which is Planned Parenthood's arm, the Guttmacher Institute, has voluntary reporting also. Well, that sounds a little bizarre. Since when does voluntary really ever work? Not very often, right? Especially when you're talking statistics. I like this Disraeli said it. There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics, right? Right? So garbage in, garbage out. There's three other things I'd like to talk about based on this. One, there's no reporting. So we underreport U.S. abortions because people don't even reveal it. And that happens in my practice all the time, unless I carefully question and make people understand why I need to know. There are no fetal death certificates when abortion occurs, so therefore they're not recorded, and no one knows that they even had an abortion when they have a maternal death. And the third thing is, as we've heard previously, most women do not come back to the abortion clinic when they have a complication. They come to me, and they come to my emergency room. They don't go to the abortion clinic. So they don't even know they had a complication because there's no record of the procedure and there's no linking of the complication. Second thing, definitional issues regarding maternal mortality are problematic and not comparable. What that really means is there's very little data except in certain databases, which I'll talk about later, that talk about this. In fact, the World Health Organization says all existing estimates, now remember that means we just make it up. That's really what it means. When you hear estimate, think made up, of maternal mortality are subject to greater or lesser degrees of uncertainty. In fact, they adjust by over 50%, most of these statistics, 50%. Now, after a while, 50% and 50% and 50% added up logarithmically makes it ridiculous is what it makes it, correct? Also, WHO, World Health Organization, has 7 different methods to talk about maternal death. 7 different methods. Which one do you want? Whichever one you like. You mean, you like this death or you like that death? It's not that way. Death is death. It's right. It's the final arbiter. Drives me nuts. Abortion-related deaths are not easily or accurately verified or identified. In fact, now let's talk about what people when they talk about maternal death. Okay? So maternal death, according to the World Health Organization, is a death of a woman while pregnant or within 42 days of the ending of the pregnancy, regardless of the site or the pregnancy, right? That's not caused or related by the pregnancy or management, but not from accidental or incidental cause. In other words, the pregnancy caused the death. That's maternal death. Late maternal death, now we're getting more fun, aren't we? Late maternal death now, not just death, late maternal death, are from more than 40 days, but less than 1 year after termination of pregnancy. Now, maternal death, up to 42 days. Who decided 42 days? They did. More than 42 days is a late maternal death. Pregnancy-related death. Now, see how this goes? Isn't this fun? Isn't this statistic? This is great, isn't it? Pregnancy-related deaths are either direct, meaning it was a direct result of your pregnancy, you died of a bleeding or maternal complication, or indirect, it aggravated your hypertension or your diabetes. And those are the things they used to talk about. In fact, a 2003 publication by Elam Evans said that the estimating methods for related deaths are inadequate and underreported. In other words, there is no system in this country. So if you get anything today, there needs to be legislation that every abortion needs to be accounted for and all maternal mortality needs to be dealt with, including those of abortion. If they take nothing else away today, that needs to happen. Pregnancy-associated deaths. Now, this is the one that the American College and the special group said we should do now is up to death, up to 1 year after delivery or pregnancy termination, regardless of any way or where it happened, whether it's an ectopic pregnancy or abortion or a miscarriage even. Third, measurements are very problematic. Generally, when you measure deaths, you say, how would you measure it? Usually it's per 100,000. It's just the way we do it, statistically and empirically. Now, the problem with it is that no one will tell you which 100,000 they're going to do, and they will actually adjust it. So there are difficulties in measuring mortality because no one will tell you what exactly the mortality is. Is it 1 year? Is it 42 days? There's a lack of consensus how to link pregnancies with maternal mortality. We know that there's at least 12 to 50% discrepancy in reporting. We know that there's incomplete records because people do not report abortions and they don't go back to their abortion providers, so they're not recorded as abortion deaths. Also, people who get these serious life-threatening problems come to me. They don't go back to the abortionist. Abortion-related deaths are not reported as maternal deaths because the abortion was never known. And in fact, if you look at, nail this in your head. Nail this in your head. This is an important point for you to take home today. If you don't think of anything else, this is one of those things to say. The risk of dying from abortion is twice as high as it is from a term pregnancy. Okay? If an uncomplicated delivery is compared to an uncomplicated abortion, the risk of dying is twice as high with the abortion. You cannot compare all abortions, first trimester abortions with all pregnancy and delivery. That's not a fair comparison. It's apples to oranges. You should compare week by week. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Available statistics also do not talk about in this country looking at long-term effects, which I'm going to talk about also, after completion of a term pregnancy. In other words, are you at risk for suicide? Are you at risk for homicide? Are you at risk for all terms death in 1 year? Do you get increased risk for breast cancer? National databases use term pregnancies associated with abortion at any point in pregnancy. Basically, what that means is this. If you do it with term deliveries, or delivery, those abortions never show up in the denominator because they don't go to term, do they? So 40% of the time, the numbers in the numerators don't show up in the denominators. That's called cheating, actually, is what that's called, right? Yeah, it's called cheating. Yeah, because you're never going to have a term pregnancy with an ectopic or a miscarriage or an abortion, now are you? No. So you can't have it comparing to a term pregnancy or a delivery, can you? So that's invalid. So every time they say this, they always want to talk about comparing to a delivery or a pregnancy that is at term and delivery. That is a lie, and it's a misuse of the statistics, and it's not apples to apples, it's apples to oranges. Don't believe it. They're not analogous because basically you have no stage of gestation. Let me share with you the data that's out there. This was published in 2004, and this is going to be very interesting too. Think this through. And this is actually on page 7 if you're following through like my wife does, right? At the top, mortality rates increase dramatically. It's almost a logarithmic function. Remember those logarithmic stuff? Remember the stuff you hated, like, oh my God, not logs? Yeah. Seriously, yeah. Those of us are, medicine, math. So 100 per 100,000 procedures, it goes from, at 13 to 15 weeks, it's 14.7 per 100,000 procedures, not 0.4, 0.3, or 0.2, or 0.1, is it? Okay, at 16 to 20 weeks, it's 29.5 per 100,000 procedures, and at greater than 20 weeks, it's 76 or 77 per 100,000 procedures. Maternal death rate here in this country is between 9 and 10 per 100,000 procedures, or 100,000 deliveries at term. So, it's not safer. It's not safer because you can't compare apples to oranges and not have all this in there and go by gestational age. Well, also, what about the research we talked about compared to childbirth? And we looked at in Part B here, it says, what about those who were pregnant? And we did a study actually in 2008 in this country and said those who had an abortion were 62% more likely to die from any cause within a year after their abortion compared to those who did not have. They were 154% more likely to commit suicide within a year after the abortion than those who did not have an abortion, or who delivered actually deliveries. And this is record linked from California, and this is Medicaid data, so they actually had the data pretty well linked. In Finland, where they collect everything, the Finns are phenomenally good. They've had a healthcare system since about 74 or 5. Everything's in there, all the healthcare encounters. What they found is that there was a 3 times higher mortality rate in abortion compared to childbirth. 3 times. 3 times higher. They also found that was a 6 times higher risk for suicide, meaning you completed the suicide, not just you attempted, but you actually completed the suicide and you killed yourself. Record linkage would have found less than 30% of those. 73% of these patients would not have been found unless they linked records. 73%. So, without statistics, you cannot make the claims that are made by the people who would like you to believe that abortion causes no harm. If you look down further, hemorrhage and infection deaths are 8 to 9 times greater in abortions compared to term deliveries. The number of abortion complications and mortality might increase 30 to 150% if we just actually collected some data for a change instead of just said, oh, give us what you feel like, right? Whatever you feel like giving to us, right? But I think, at least my patients, when I have a reasonable women, I consider most of my patients to be fairly reasonable women. Well, maybe not all. And I'm not very reasonable either sometimes, yeah. A reasonable patient would like to include all causes of abortion and death, right? So they would include suicide, perhaps breast cancer risks, death from hemorrhage, suicide, and or all causes and homicides. Your death rate's 3 to 4 times higher if you have this abortion, ma'am. I just want you to know that. Your risk for suicide is 6 times higher. I want you to know that before I do this. Just like if I do your cesarean section, you can bleed to death, or you can become infected, you can die from this. If you have a pulmonary embolism, you can die from this. Well, try to save your baby, but you can still die from this. That's what you have to tell people. But they don't tell people that. Well, what's the most recent stuff, which is fascinating? I love this last stuff because Dr. Koch and Dr. Carroll did some very interesting things. Patrick Carroll's actually an actuarial. And he looked at all the data in 42 years in the United Kingdom and found out that basically the death rate in England and Scotland and Wales was about 2 to 3 times higher with legal abortion than in the Republic of Ireland with no abortion. The death rate was like 1 or 2 per 100,000. It's 8 to 9 or 10 per 100,000. So again, and Koch actually looked at Mexico. The estimates were over a tenfold overestimation of mortality. In fact, they found mortality dropped when they made abortion illegal. Dropped by 30%. That doesn't fit the facts, does it? Abortions actually made mortality less. Imagine that. Mental health. Basically, I'm going to talk about Coleman's data mostly. There was a meta-analysis done in 2011 and 10. There were 100 studies she looked at. And what she basically found was that if you categorized women and you looked at coercion, you looked at ambivalence, you looked at committed to the pregnancy, you looked at adolescent mental health problems, conflicted relationship, negative relationships, poor quality abortion care, that is no counseling, these are all related to bad outcomes. And what she actually found, which is actually going back to page 11, is that she found increased risk for suicide, alcohol abuse, depression, anxiety, and also use of marijuana. And in fact, what she was able to calculate, which is very interesting for terms of mental health, is that 20% of women who abort suffered serious psychological problems. 20%. And what she also did was say that from basically, there was a 34 to 230% risk of an adverse outcome in terms of your psychological well-being. And she said there's actually a 10% incident of mental health problems directly attributable to abortion. So what I did is I did my usual simple math. I'm a simple guy. I'm an obstetrician. You know, you're either pregnant, you're not. It's either in the uterus, it's not, right? It's either term or it's not. I mean, seriously, right? It's pretty binomial for me. And I said, well, what about if we have 1.2 million abortions a year? That's 120,000 women affected every year by mental health issues, by abortion. That's enough to fill your DC stadium twice every year. It's about 55,000, 60,000 people, right? Twice a year. Well, I said, well, wait a minute. What if there's 50 million abortions been done over the last 40 years? That's enough. That's 5 million women affected. That's enough to fill a city of Chicago times 2 over. That's 5 million people. Well, wait a minute. That can't be true. Well, it is true. The data says it's true. So to say there's no effects, I'll bet you if I talk to somebody in this room, you don't have to raise your hand. You know somebody, or somebody you have, or you yourself have been affected by abortion, and someone you know has had a horrific psychological or mental health problems from abortion. I know it's true. I know it's true, because I see it every day in my clinic. And it's higher than 10%, believe me, you. And I'm going to save my best for last. I've only got 2 or 3 minutes here. This is my heart. This is my heart. Preterm birth, okay? I'm a maternal fetal medicine. I do high-risk obstetrics every day, and it breaks my heart when people deliver their babies at 24, 25, 26 weeks, and their babies are just either don't survive or they suffer terribly. Well, I know you find it hard to believe, but there are 138 studies now. Oh, but they don't really mean that. That's just junk science. You're going to hear that term, junk science. You heard that term, junk science? That's what we're going to talk about me. I'm junk science. Well, there's 138 peer-reviewed, published studies now in the literature since 1973. Oh, what an interesting year that would be, 73, 74. That's familiar, isn't it? That show an increased risk for preterm delivery with abortion, with elective abortion. There's been several meta-analyses. It increases your rate between 37 and 93%. The risk goes up if you have more abortions. In other words, there's a dose effect. The least you would see is 30 to 40%. I've seen as high as 200 or 300% increased risk quoted. In fact, there was a great study done in 2012 that looked at the 2 or more abortions. The risk for delivery before 28 weeks was increased by 70%. 3 or more abortions increase your risk by 178%. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but a baby below 28 weeks is a disaster. A disaster. Furthermore, they found that 3 or more abortions increase your risk by 35% below 37 weeks, and it increased your risk for a very premature birth by over 125% below 28 weeks with abortions and multiple abortions. And it's basically, we see this over and over and over again. 2005 study, the same study, 70% likely to deliver before 28 weeks. 800% increased risk by preterm birth by women who've had 2 or more abortions. The Institute of Medicine actually says that first trimester abortion is a risk factor for subsequent preterm birth. The National Academy of Science says that. Institute of Medicine. It's 30 to 40% with just 1 abortion. Also, there may be as high as an 8 or 10 times increased risk with multiple abortions delivering before 28 weeks. I'll close again with reminding you what I came to tell you. Based on the overwhelming scientific evidence presented by myself today and in my handout, and you can get it whatever you want. I've got all the references if you want them, including the 138 studies, should you be sleepy at night and want to go get a little nighttime reading. There exists the following effects on women's health by elective abortion. They're indisputable, they're scientific. People need to stop denying it. They need to step up to the plate and admit it. increased risk of death, increased risk of mental health problems, including suicide, homicides, sleep deprivation, anxiety, and depression, and 3, an increased risk of a preterm or a very preterm 28-week baby. So everyone needs to be aware of this. All women need to have this given, and it should be in the informed consents, because if it's not, they're not giving women truth, and they're not treating women with the respect that they deserve. Thank you.